Howdy folks, welcome back to the Steampunk Desperado channel. Today's topic is superheroes. Yeah, a lot of you probably think that's just kid stuff, but realize, of course, that a lot of adults are watching, and a lot of these movies are very popular. I define superhero fiction as a story featuring one or more costumed heroes, usually with abilities that normal humans don't have. Thus, it's speculative, out of the ordinary. Science fiction. Superhero fiction has been around for as long as I can remember, which is probably far longer than a lot of you out there have been alive. I remember saving my allowance to buy my favorite comic books, which were Superman and Batman. What was the price back then when I was first buying them? 10 cents an issue. Then inflation hit and it went up to 12 cents. Yeah, you had a couple pennies. And then 15. It's been many years since I've actually bought a normal comic book. That, a Marvel or DC or one of those other superhero type knockoffs. I have bought a fair number of graphic novels and manga, but that's kind of a different animal. Anyway, I looked it up online, and the current price of comic books seems to be around $5 an issue. Though we're talking a fair bit about comics today, again, our major point, our major subject is the superhero. The two go together just like beans and cornbread, as the old song goes. But of course, not all comic books are about superheroes, and not all superheroes are in comic books. Imagine the Archie comics, and then of course we have the movies and the streaming series that have the superheroes in them. People write even novels about them. More importantly, they're such a big part of our culture that recent changes in the characters and storylines of these popular characters have provoked heated controversy. Superhero fiction is just another form of science fiction, like steampunk or space opera. How did this weird subgenre come about? Well, it's a really interesting history. Heroic fiction has been with us since Beowulf, and certainly before that. The hero is someone we can admire and aspire to in our own limited way. Even when the hero meets a tragic end, it tells us something about the human struggle. In centuries past, these stories often involved knights in armor and fighting with dragons and magic, wizards, evil wizards, and so on. In other words, fantasy. So it's a lot like science fiction even back then. In the late 19th and early 20th century, new printing methods made books more affordable for the normal common people. Thus, writers could publish a lot more frequently. When you need to produce lots of content, one obvious strategy is to recycle and reuse characters you've already popularized. Thus was born serialization. What this originally meant was to break up a novel-length story into parts and print it in a weekly or monthly magazine or periodical in installments. Charles Dickens was a pioneer in this art, publishing many of the most famous novels in serial form. Other writers would publish multiple short stories with the same settings and characters, also in periodicals. This was the perfect format for heroic fiction. One of the early serialized heroes that we still remember is Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. Holmes was a man with a solitary lifestyle and exceptional intelligence, who could solve crimes that no one else could. The Holmes stories contain the independent prime fighter trope that we recognize from superhero stories, but despite his great intelligence, Sherlock is not flashy enough for this category. The genesis of the superhero, according to a lot of people, was the 1905 book The Scarlet Pimpernel by the Baroness Orczy, a Hungarian-born British novelist. Yes, one of those female writers who could never get published in those chauvinist times. The Scarlet Pimpernel popularized a special kind of hero, the anonymous lone vigilante. The story is set during the Reign of Terror after the French Revolution, where a British nobleman, kind of a fop, actually is a hero. He dons a disguise, wields a sword to rescue aristocrats from the guillotine because these revolutionaries were lunatics, really. Because of his daring exploits and secret identity, Marvel creator Stan Lee said that the Scarlet Pimpernel was the first superhero. He's an ordinary man with no supernatural powers, but he does have exceptional skills, smarts, and bravery. The other necessary element to make superheroes super popular was, of course, the comic book, which came from the comic strip, which first appeared in newspapers in the 1800s. This is, by definition, a story told in pictures, usually with captions. Supposedly, the inventor of the comic strip was a Swiss schoolmaster named Rodolphe Topfer. His very first work was The Loves of Mr. Vaubois in 1827. And what they were, again, they were just pictures with captions in order. In French, they were called bande dessinée, kind of a sequential narrative. Though the first modern comic in the form we know today was The Yellow Kid, which appeared in 1895 in many newspapers in the United States. It featured humor and social commentary and introduced the word balloon. Yeah, a little balloon with all the talk on it. Comic strips were another form of serialization, and serialized novels were another form, in that we would have full-length novels coming out one after another with the same characters. And they brought us recurring heroes such as Zorro, Tarzan of the Apes, and Conan the Barbarian. A lot of these were considered pulp, which lowbrow, but they were very popular and in some cases fairly good stories. Other recurring heroes originated with a new medium of radio, such as the Lone Ranger, who first appeared in the 1930s. But again, the comic strip was the perfect medium for public accessibility. You didn't have to buy a radio, and you didn't have to read all that well. Just a few years later, in 1933, writer Jerry Siegel and artist Joe Shuster started working on a character that they called Superman. Now, it took them a few years to sell this, but eventually they sold a company called National Comics, and they started publishing this story, and it was an instant hit. They coined the term superhero in their marketing material. Thus was born a whole industry, thousands of comic books with hundreds of characters. Wikipedia lists all these characters in order of their appearance. It was started with the Scarlet Pimpernel way back in 1905. And they include familiar characters such as Flash, Captain Marvel, Wonder Woman, Submariner, and a whole bunch you've never heard of. All had most of the elements of that formula. Now, all superheroes are not created equal. They range from masked vigilantes such as Batman, who have no supernatural powers, much like the Scarlet Pimpernel, to those who are practically godlike, such as Superman, Captain Marvel, etc. But all superheroes have the elements of heroism and wish fulfillment, which make them resonate especially with boys and young men. That should be enough to make them popular, but we need to note that a lot of them appeared right at the end of the Great Depression, when people needed something to distract them, some escapism, and when the world was beginning to be torn by war. Now, even though America didn't get into World War II until 1941, the war in Europe had started 2 years earlier, and the war in the Pacific 2 years before that. As isolated as Americans were, the world situation was pretty dang frightening. Even if it was only subconsciously, I think Americans needed heroes that they could assure us that good would triumph over evil. Then in 1942, when all the older brothers were being drafted, American kids, especially boys, were in dire need of escapist fantasies. And Superman did fight Nazis sometimes. With the end of the war and the return to normalcy, the popularity of superheroes declined for a time. And kids turned to more realistic material, such as westerns, crime, and horror. Then in 1954, there was a moral panic about comics, supposedly causing juvenile delinquency, led by Dr. Frederick Bertram's book, Seduction of the Innocent. That controversy and the ensuing crackdown could be another topic in itself, but it caused crime and horror comics to pretty much go away. I mean, the restrictions were so onerous that, for example, EC switched to humor. EC, which was horror, switched to humor, and Mad Magazine was born. What replaced the other comics that went away? Superheroes. They came back because of simple black and white morality fitting perfectly with the new restrictions. Looking back, this was one of the principal problems of superhero fiction. Because it was aimed at kids, it had to be safe. And because it was safe, there was no room for any kind of nuance or moral complexity. Occasionally, there were moral dilemmas that a superhero might agonize over, but they never really questioned their commitment to goodness and justice and the American way. That improved somewhat when Marvel introduced characters that had a little bit more depth, like Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk, both in 1962. Spider-Man was a teenager, and that was kind of a new thing. He didn't even have any mentor. He wasn't like Robin with Batman, and he had a very realistic, angst-driven social life. And the Hulk had it even worse. He was kind of like Jekyll and Hyde. He'd undergone some, I forget, radiation or something, and he would turn into the Hulk, except that somehow his monstrous character would do good instead of evil, as in the Robert Louis Stevenson story. Stories did get a little bit more interesting at that point. Another problem, though, was that back in the height of their popularity, comic books were purely episodic. Thus, the characters who weren't all that interesting to begin with, I mean, Superman was a pretty stiff character, pretty serious. Thus, the characters would not have any way to grow or evolve. This changed with the appearance of graphic novels. It was kind of a paradigm shift in the 1980s, such as Dark Knight Returns, in which the story arc could stretch over several issues. It was also returned to the more mature stories with moral ambiguity, and a partial return to Batman's roots. The Caped Crusader was a very edgy character back in 1939. He would sometimes personally execute criminals who we felt were irredeemable. Nowadays, that we think is new, but it's not. As I said, superheroes are not all created equal. I divide them into three categories by level of power. This may seem irrelevant, but the premise has a lot to do with how relatable and interesting the story is. First, there's what I call the natural hero. This is the self-made man, very rarely a woman, who has no special or supernatural powers. The Precursors were masked vigilantes, such as the Scarlet Pimpernel and the Shadow, a radio character from the 1930s. Natural heroes include, of course, Batman, 1939, Green Hornet, 1936, also from radio, but some of you who are old like me may remember him from TV. And, of course, Iron Man, 1963, who would be nothing without his suit. These characters probably shouldn't be considered superheroes at all because they have no powers. And if comics were realistic, and why would they be? They wouldn't be able to compete with powered superheroes. But of course, they are called superheroes because of marketing reasons, and so they can team up with others. And in a way, their humanity makes them more impressive and relatable, which is probably why, as a kid, Batman was actually my favorite. On the other end of the spectrum are the godlike heroes, like Superman, 1938, and Captain Marvel, who first appeared in 1940. By the way, the current female Captain Marvel is part of a lineage that began in 1967 and has no connection whatsoever to the original Captain Marvel except for the name. But she still has pretty godlike powers. This class of heroes is nearly indestructible and typically has super strength and the ability to fly. The drawback is that they are so powerful that the writers need to invent some random weakness. In Superman's case, it is kryptonite. and that makes it more interesting. As a kid, I really couldn't identify much with Superman, but I liked his stories because of his great powers. He could travel to other planets and meet aliens, or sometimes aliens came after him, which made him a lot more science fiction-y and fanciful. Then there's the middle tier, the characters with superpowers who aren't actually all powerful. Sometimes it's a single power like the Flash, who can just run really fast. Or they have a small number of related powers, like Aquaman's sea-related abilities, which I think didn't Family Guy mock that? Or Spider-Man's spider-based powers. Spider-Man is a good representative of the middle tier because he has strength and speed, but he's not indestructible. And he can't fly. He also uses a device that he invented himself, the web shooter, which makes him a bit of a hybrid with the good old natural hero. Now, the middle tier, those are the ones that more likely get put on teams. Teams like the X-Men or the Fantastic Four, the Justice League. Perhaps because on their own they're not all that interesting. I don't know. Although I personally thought Wolverine was pretty cool. But any reasonably popular character that's been around for a long time, that's actually lasted for decades, has developed a very devoted following. We Americans have no heroic tales anymore. I mean, we don't have the tales of antiquity like Hercules and Beowulf. We used to have folktale heroes, Daniel Boone, Paul Bunyan, and so on, but those have kind of fallen by the wayside. I mean, academics consider them racist and dated, which is silly, but that's the way it is. And we don't have heroic tales in religion. I mean, Catholicism has saints and martyrs, but in general, modern Christianity is kind of dull as far as stories go. Consequently, superheroes have become the American mythology. This is, I think, the reason for the controversy that I alluded to earlier at the beginning of the show. When you take a beloved character that people have been following since childhood and change him, people get upset. For reasons of ideology, the companies have morphed the race and the gender and the identity of the character. Obviously, I have nothing against, black superheroes or gay superheroes or whatever. In fact, Black Panther has been around since the 1960s and was a very popular African superhero. But of course, because of ideology, they have to change things. Straight characters become gay, and that rubs a lot of people the wrong way. Many formerly good characters are recast as evil or Nazi villains, which I think is the most egregious thing that these woke creators do. To be fair, we do need to allow for characters to change at times, or it gets kind of boring. The episodic model was a problem, which would make things rather dull after a while. That's why they do an occasional reboot of an old character that we hadn't seen for a while. And for example, Plastic Man. Now, Plastic Man had first been created in 1941. And when they reappeared, when they did a new Plastic Man in 1966, I'd never heard of him. I thought he was brand new. And I had the #1 issue. And I lost the silly thing. Probably would have been worth some money. While we're on that topic, episodic versus story arc, I have to mention the weird compromise that a lot of these writers came up with. The imaginary tale. Imaginary. In the days of purely episodic storytelling, the status quo could never change. Batman is an eternal bachelor. Robin never grows up. Superman and Lois Lane are forever dating, but they barely ever kiss. Thus, to provide variety, the imaginary tale, as they called it, allowed the writer to make some world-breaking change, like killing a character or having longtime partners either marry or break up or whatever, and they would reset it at the end, you know? But the nomenclature was hilarious. I recall an episode of The Simpsons where the comic book guy, big heavy guy who ran the comic book store, is pitching a comic book to Bart. This is an imaginary tale where Superman marries Lois Lane and they have a mutant baby. And Bart says, "Aren't they all imaginary?" And comic book guy says, "Get out of my store." Seriously, though, as a writer, my primary interest is in writing. How are the stories crafted? And how does it work with superheroes since they're no longer just for kids? That's given us a lot of satires and deconstructions, such as Watchmen and The Boys, which I won't get into here. That could be a whole nother topic. The well-known series themselves have sadly declined with that emphasis on ideology that I talked about before, which has in turn led to a huge drop-off of comic book sales. You're alienating the main target audience of boys and young men. So what do they expect when sales drop? Now, at first, they didn't care that much because the movies were the big money makers. In the last couple of years, though, we've seen some steeply declined ticket sales for the once invincible superhero movie. Is that just temporary? Is it just fatigue from oversaturation, like with vampire shows after Twilight? Or will superheroes not come back? And if they don't, what will replace them? That's a question for another time. This has been my show on superheroes, their past, present, and possible future. Please let me know what you think about it in the comments below. Please also like and subscribe and check out my works on Amazon. I have 5 novels, some short stories in other people's collections, and also a few short stories of my own. For example, Love at Stake. How does a 300-year-old vampire find love in the modern world? Well, he goes online. Also, Found Pet. A down on his luck real estate salesman finds a strange animal, adopts it, and finds his life has changed in some pretty odd and mysterious ways. Kind of a Twilight Zone kind of thing. For now, this is Steampunk Desperado saying adios, amigos, from the Steampunk Desperado channel, where the past meets the future and the present is extraordinary.